Well, hello, church, and welcome back to our Wednesday night series, The Names of God. This week in our Names of God study, we're going to look at the most important of God's names, his proper name, which is Yahweh, or as we call it. It's a shame that more of us don't understand that God has a proper name, but we don't typically think of God as having a name like John or Dave. We simply refer to him as God or the Lord. And that's all right, but there's a whole lot more that we can understand and know about God by knowing his proper name, Yahweh. Like I said a minute ago, too, that's the way we say it, but the true pronunciation to us and to anybody really in the world is a mystery. It's unknown. And I'll explain why that is as well. The name that we call Yahweh is made up of the Hebrew letters YHWH, and that's our letters, not the way the Hebrew is pronounced as the names of those letters. The name is also referred to as the Tetragrammaton, which simply means the four letters. The name Yahweh occurs over 6,800 times in the Old Testament, making it above and beyond the most common reference to God, which makes sense because if there was a book written about you or me, the most common reference to me, if a book was written about me, would most likely be my proper name. And that's why it's the most common reference of God's name. It is his proper name. During the 3rd century, the Jewish people stopped saying the name Yahweh for fear that they would violate the commandment, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain." Exodus 20, verse 7. And for fear that they were going to violate that commandment, they stopped saying the name Yahweh. Just they didn't want to misuse it. You might ask, well, since it's just YHWH, if it's just consonants, then where did those vowels come from that the Jews put in there to make the name Yahweh? Well, they took the consonants from another name from the vowels from another name from God, Adonai, and they simply borrowed consonants from another name of God in that place and to come up with the name Yahweh. Now, in my Bible, and most likely in yours as well, the instances of the word Lord that you see in Exodus 20, verse 7 in that commandment is the word Lord is L-O-R-D in all capital letters. And anytime in your Bible you see L-O-R-D and it's all capital letters, that is what is in our English translation Bibles, Yahweh, YHWH in the Hebrew. In Hebrew Bibles, and a lot of Hebrew Bibles or Jewish Bibles today, they would, instead of having Lord or instead of having Yahweh or YHWH, they'll just simply it'll just say the name, because again they're trying to make sure that they don't violate the commandment. Alternative spellings for YHWH or Yahweh are sometimes Yehovah with a Y, Yehovah with a Y, or Jehovah with a J, and we're familiar with those as well. So says the verse, "You shall not take the name of Yahweh, your God, in vain, for Yahweh will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain." That's exactly what the commandment actually says, which gives it a little bit different perspective to us. Now, when the Jews read the Old Testament out loud and they came to the name Yahweh, they used an alternative name for God. They used the name that we covered last week in our study, Adonai, which simply means master. So they just used a substitute instead of using God's proper name. They had a whole system in place for not violating God's name, not misusing it. And our English translators, for whatever purposes, they decided that they would stick with that same system and do the same thing. And that's why when Yahweh is in the Old Testament, they write Lord, all in caps. But the problem this creates for people reading the English translations of the Bible is that we are robbed of over, like I said, almost 7,000 times of seeing God's proper name. And I think that makes a difference. You know, why might I say that? Why do I think it makes a difference? Well, because like I've been teaching in the last few weeks, the name of God isn't simply a name as we know names. The name of God is who God is, and it reveals who God is. Like my name, Wes, that name does not reveal who I am, but God's names do reveal who He is. They are His character. They are who He is in actuality. So let's enhance our understanding and our worship of God by understanding His proper name, Yahweh. Now we know God's proper name only because God chose to reveal it to us. But He first revealed it to Moses in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 through 15. Then Moses said to God, "Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is His name? What shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And He said, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you." God furthermore said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations." So God gives Moses 3 answers to his question. When Moses says, "What is your name?" God says this. In verse 14, God says, "I am who I am." In verse 14 again, God says, "I am has sent you." Then in verse 15, God says, "Yahweh has sent you." Now, if you do your own Bible study, you'll see that this isn't the first time that you'll see the name Yahweh in your Bible. You'll see it first in the book of Genesis. But He doesn't reveal His name as Yahweh until the book of Exodus. You might think, well, how can this be? And the answer is very simple. He revealed His name first to Moses. And who wrote the book of Genesis? None other than Moses. Easy enough. Okay, so we also see in this passage that God gives us an interpretation of His name, Yahweh, as meaning, I am, or I am who I am. Now, at first glance, and the first time I remember reading this, I thought that's very confusing. God's name is I am, or I am who I am, and that just didn't make a lot of sense to me. But upon looking deeper, it teaches us a whole lot about God. I'm going to give you some points tonight. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I have 7 quick points for you. The first thing that we learn about God by His name is the most important of the truths about God, the very most important one, and that being that He exists. Now, if you believe God exists, what difference does that make in your life? Consider this. Imagine going on a trip with your best friend. You show up at their home, you load their stuff in their car, and then you hit the road. Except on this trip, you never look at your friend. You never make eye contact. You never say a word, and you don't respond to a single thing that is said to you. Now, if I asked you on this trip, do you believe in the existence of your friend? You'd probably look at me and say, of course I do. Now, you also may be thinking, Wes, this example is bizarre. What are you getting at? That sounds ridiculous. No, church, it's actually not ridiculous. What's ridiculous is a person who says that they believe in the existence of God, but they live their life as if He doesn't exist. God does exist. He is right here with us right now. And the more we consider, the more we meditate simply upon the existence of God, believe me, church, because I've been putting this into practice, it affects your words, it affects your actions, it affects everything that you do. You see everything through a different perspective when you consider that God is right beside you all the time. God doesn't show up on Sunday morning and then go home. He's with you 24/7. And I ask you, how often do you consider Him? The second thing we learn about God by his name is that he defines what reality is. He defines reality. You know, you'll hear a lot of people saying things in our world like, your truth is this, and my truth is that. But contrary to popular modern thought, there is only one reality. There is only one truth. If I asked you, how did you become who you are? You know, you're probably going to have a pretty complex answer to that question, with lots and lots of variables and factors. But if I asked God the same question, God, how did you become who you are? His response would be simply, I am. It's an unanswerable question because the question is based upon a false assumption. It's like asking the question, what's the best way to cheat? There is no best way to cheat. It's wrong to cheat. The whole question is based upon a false assumption. God did not become, and I know it's hard for us, well, impossible for us to wrap our minds around truly. God did not become, God is. He never was, and he never will be. And the only reality that we ever know and experience comes directly from him. Now, if you feel like we're swimming in deep water right now, you're absolutely right. And if you're trying to understand something that overwhelms you, if you think that's overwhelming, just try explaining something or teaching something that you don't understand yourself. Then you'd understand what I feel like right now. And I appreciate your graciousness. Okay, so the third thing that we learn about God by his name is that God does not change. Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6 says, God says, I, Yahweh, or in the Bible it just says the Lord, I, the Lord, or I, Yahweh, do not change. There are no forces outside of God that change God. Consider this. How often do you change what you think? It's constant with our kind. And when I say with our kind, I mean human beings. It's a constant thing to change what you think. There's a name, for instance. There's a name that I used to like, but then I spent a week with someone who has that very name, and that person was a very obnoxious person. And by the end of the week, I didn't like that name anymore. But that was many years ago. I could meet that person again today and see that that person has now changed considerably, and then that name could regain favor with me. Here's something that God never says. God has never said, you know, it occurred to me. Nothing occurs to God because God always knows everything. God also never said these words, I learned. God doesn't learn. It's impossible to learn if you know everything. Another thing God has never said, how shocking. Nothing catches God off guard. Nothing surprises him. He saw the beginning and the end before he created the beginning and the end. He knows every single thing from the beginning to the end, everything in between. James chapter 1 and verse 7 says of God, there is no variation. That means there are no changes whatsoever with God. And Jesus' nature is the same as God's. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Okay, the fourth thing that we learn about God by his name is that God is unceasing. Unceasing, never-ending power. God is absolute power, another way you might say it. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 28 says, do you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, Yahweh, the creator of the heavens, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. All power, all energy, all life flows from Yahweh. He is powerful, he is power, and he is energy, and he is life. He never becomes more powerful. He never becomes less powerful. He is pure, overwhelming power, unending energy, all of the time. To unbelieving people in the world, the great mystery of all time is how the universe began as we know it. The great dilemma of scientists. How did it all start? And against everything that unbelieving scientists know to be scientific, they simply say a great scientific heresy. They say it just happened. The great problem with that theory is that nothing just happens. Energy, power, and life must have an ever-flowing, never-ending power source. To them, I would say, open your eyes to the truth and behold Yahweh. Behold the great I am, the source of all things that hold any power, any energy, and any life. Acts chapter 17, verse 28 says, in him we live and move and exist. The very enemies of God who live in a constant rebellion against him, who even deny his existence. Here's a great irony. They are all, to the very last one, daily sustained by God's power. A fifth thing that we learn about God by his name is that God defines himself. God defines himself. You know, what do I mean by that? I mean this. I don't get any say, none whatsoever, in defining who God is. In this world that we're currently living in, there are huge movements that have the objective of defining who God is. And they say things like, to me, God is fill in the blank. We don't get to say that. We don't get to mold God into what we would have him to be. When God says, I am who I am, that leaves no room for my ideas. That leaves no room for my desires of who God is. A sixth thing that we learned by implication from the last point is that I have to conform to God. He doesn't conform to me. We don't add God to our life. We surrender our entire life to God. But people are so used to having their way in this life and getting what they want. They think that they can bend God and mold him to their desires. Now, if you're guilty of this, I beg you to reconsider your thinking in light of who God is. The unchanging Yahweh would have you to align your thinking with his thinking. He, to this point in history, he is being gracious and patient with mankind more than anyone fully understands. Mold yourself to him while you still can. And the seventh and final thing that I'll add just in this lesson, there are many more things we could talk about, but the seventh and final thing that I'll add that we can learn about God by his true and proper name Yahweh is that he loves us. Now we know this because he didn't have to make himself known to us, but he did. He has made himself known to all generations. There's not a single generation of this earth that has ever lived that he's not revealed himself to. But our age, the age that we live in, is the most blessed of all generations. Why would I say that? I say that because to our generation, to our age, he has made himself known in the flesh of Jesus Christ. John chapter 8, verses 56 through 59. Jesus said, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to Jesus, you are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. He says the name of God. And then continuing, verse 59, therefore they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. You know what Jesus is saying to that crowd? Jesus is telling that crowd straight to their face, I am God. And of course they didn't believe him. They didn't believe him, so they grabbed rocks and they picked up rocks to try to kill him, and Jesus had to slip out of there. It wasn't his time yet. Today, Jesus is saying the same thing to you. He's saying the same thing to me. He's saying the same thing to anyone who would listen to him. Here are the things he's saying from our lesson. He's saying, I exist. Put your faith in me, and you will always exist with me. He's saying, I'm real. Don't be deceived by the world. Look to me for your truth and your reality. He's saying, I don't change. My grace and love and forgiveness will never diminish for those who belong to me, and you can rely on me. He's saying, I have the power to uphold all things. I have the power to save you, and I have the power to keep you. He's saying, follow me, conform to me. I have the words of life. And he's saying, I've proven my love to you by dying for you. Look to the cross and be saved. Look to the cross and you'll get an understanding of what it means to be loved by me. Until, until next week, church, love God and love others. I'm Wes LaFleur, signing off.